Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We are, what did we just say, 15 days away from Christmas as we're
15
recording this?
days. Oh my gosh. Yes.
This is one of those years where the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas is the shortest.
Yeah, because
So it,
Thanksgiving was so late.
yes. So it, like, it was like Thanksgiving and then immediately Christmas. If you actually follow on the religious side, the Advent part of it, that started that Sunday after Thanksgiving.
Oh my goodness.
That
So
was
it's
the
like,
first Sunday of Advent. So we've had 2 Sundays of Advent already. And so it's just coming up so fast.
yeah, because like my son came out for Thanksgiving and then basically, he went home Saturday and it's almost like turning around,
And coming
it's
back.
like and coming back. Because there's
Yes.
just, I don't like it when Thanksgiving's that late because it just pushes everything so quickly and everything's so squashed.
I know it feels like you're like trying to do all the family stuff, one thing right after another. But I did at least. I got all the decorating done. It took me a week this year. Normally, it doesn't take me that long. Although, I mean, I decorate the whole first
Yes.
floor of our house and we decorate outside. Normally, I do it that weekend after Thanksgiving, but that Friday, I actually didn't do any because I was tired that Friday. I think because I
Yeah.
cooked on Thursday and
Mhm.
it had been a busy week leading up to it. That Friday, I don't even think I got dressed. I brushed my teeth that day, but I think I stayed in my pajamas all day and
Oh,
didn't
nice.
leave the house. Like it was one of the, so I didn't actually get started until Saturday. But then because we've had so many other obligations, it took me like a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there. And finally, I think on Thursday or Friday of this week, I said I'm finally done. I put up the last like few things and it's done.
Yeah, I've given up on having the Martha Stewart perfect house, and there's last minute things. We got everything up, I think. I think that we want to put up this year, and that's it. I mean, Tom already had the wreath up outside and the outside decorations up first part of before Thanksgiving.
Oh, that
So
was good.
yeah, that was nice. So
I felt really guilty because Dave put up the lights on the outside of the house either the Monday or the Tuesday after Thanksgiving while I was at work. And when I got home, of course, it was already dark. I didn't notice. They were on and everything. And I truly
Mhm.
didn't notice when I pulled into the garage. It had been one of those days where it was just like busy and
Just
stuff
get
was
me in.
happening. And I felt so bad. He's like, "Did you notice the lights?" And I was like, "What lights?" And I felt so bad.
What
So
lights? All those amazing lights that you put
they
up.
look
Gorgeous
gorgeous
there.
as usual. He made everything looks gorgeous.
Oh,
I just felt so
yeah.
bad that I hadn't, because we had neighbors in our neighborhood that had put up their lights before Thanksgiving. And so they'd been up for so long. And I'd kind of like had gotten to the point where, yeah, lights, 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 whatever. So when I pulled into our own driveway that day, I didn't notice.
Oh.
I felt so bad. So I'm sorry, honey, that I didn't notice your lights, but I promise I've noticed them since and they look gorgeous and we're
And
feeling
she
very
just
festive
told the
now.
world. She just told the world just now how beautiful your lights are.
Yes. And that I totally missed it. But keeping in the tradition of sort of the holiday spirit. So this week's episode, again, trying to keep it lighter. I know we're a podcast about cemeteries and we talk a lot about death and things, but I like to try and keep it lighter this time of year. I read an article and I cannot remember where the article was, but it was a recent article that came out about the popularity of detective stories during Christmas in the UK, especially. Like, I think it's kind of a worldwide thing, but they were
Mhm.
saying, especially in the UK, if you go into any of the bookstores there, they will have window displays, table displays, whatever, of like all these detective stories. And a lot of them take place at or around Christmas or have a winter theme or whatever. And within the last like 4 years, so really since like the pandemic started, they just grew in popularity, these stories. And a lot of older stories from the 30s and 40s have made a comeback and they've been republished in like collections. So it's like a lot of short stories and they published them in collections. And so that got me thinking, well, why would these detective stories, like that's not what you typically think of at Christmas time that you want to read, especially since a lot of them tend to revolve around like a murder mystery sort of thing or
Right.
whatever. But they are kind of fun. And so I started looking into this a little more and I discovered, and maybe other people knew about this, but I didn't know about it. But back in 1930, there was a club that formed called the Detection Club. And this was formed in the UK, and it was made up of many of the UK's most prominent detective writers who were writing all of these stories. And so we're going to start. I told Diane I'm starting backwards from our outline. So I'm starting at the bottom because there's 4 people I want to acknowledge out of the 20. Well, some things I read said 26 members originally, some said 28. But of the original 26 or 28, there were 4 very prominent writers that were part of this group that got it going. The founder, his name was Anthony Berkeley Cox. He actually wrote under 2 or 3 different names, depending on what he was writing, what he published. And I could not discover where he is buried or where he might have cremains. All I could find out was his date of death, which was March 9th, 1971. There's a good chance he was cremated and maybe had his ashes spread, or maybe his family still has them in an urn somewhere. I don't know. I couldn't find like a final resting place for him. The other 3 important members here are Dorothy Sayers, who is a very big writer in her day. She died December 17th, 1957. She did choose to be cremated, and her cremains are at St. Anne Churchyard, Soho, which is the city of Westminster in Greater London, England. So not Westminster, Colorado, for our Colorado listeners. We do have a Westminster here too, but this is the one in England. And then we also have G.K. Chesterton, who died June 14th, 1936. His remains are at Shepherd's Lane Cemetery, Beaconsfield, South Bucks District, Buckinghamshire, England. And the final one, who I'm pretty sure most listeners, no matter what part of the world you live in, have at least heard her name, is Agatha Christie, who died January 12th, 1976. And her remains are at St. Mary's Churchyard in Chosley or Closley. I'm not sure how the British pronounce it. South Oxfordshire District, Oxfordshire, England. So, like I said, I know a lot of people have heard Agatha Christie's name.
Oh, definitely. So the Detection Club was founded in 1930 by Anthony Berkeley Cox, as Jenny mentioned. He was the writer of the Father Brown series. And isn't Father Brown, aren't they doing something with him or had done something with him like on Masterpiece Theater? Because
And I think I'm fairly certain that I've seen some of the episodes, because I think there was like a BBC show that was the Father Brown series, and it was the mysteries that he solved. But yes, he is the writer of the books for that before it became TV oriented.
The club's purpose was to bring together writers, critics, and enthusiasts of the genre. Martin Edwards, current president, says that the idea was that the members would be people who wrote detective fiction of high caliber. They would have produced at least 2 such books, and they would be elected by a secret ballot by the existing members. So it wasn't like any schmuck could get into this club.
Right.
So it was a self-selecting elite, if you like. Thriller writers were not allowed in, and the theory was that the standards of detective fiction were to be elevated. And you said it was founded in 1930, and it's still going strong, you said.
Yes. So Martin Edwards, who you just quoted, he's the current president. So it's 94 years old, and they still are a group of detective writers, and he's published things himself. He's written a lot of things, but it still has the same thing. And part of it was a social club too. So one of the things that Anthony Berkeley Cox was doing was trying to sort of create a social circle for himself of these writers who wrote the same types of stories he was writing at the time, because he was a little bit lonely. Because being a writer, when you're holed up, writing stories and creating characters in your head, but it can be a bit lonely. And he wanted to be able to socialize with other people who were doing the same type of thing.
Because there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't Zoom, there wasn't all these other ways to connect with people.
And so they formed this club, and they actually ended up renting space at, England has all their clubs, the gentlemen's clubs and all these restaurant clubs and stuff. They actually, the money that they made from some of this stuff and money that they all gave to the club and stuff, paid for rent at a particular location for a long, long time, and helped them be able to meet there and have these dinner parties and meetings and things like that, so that they had a place to meet and they would talk about their writing, and they would help critique each other, and they would help edit people and give people ideas. They also wrote several things together where they all submitted like one chapter of the story. And there's 3 books that are actually published that I could find. There might be more, but I know I found 3 books that were published that they all wrote collectively: The Floating Admiral, Ask a Policeman, and 6 Against the Yard, which you can all purchase today. They're all still very purchasable. They've been reprinted, but they all contributed to those. So I think that was really cool that they did that.
That is very cool. So between the 2 world wars, detective stories experienced a surge in popularity. The trauma and uncertainty of the times created a desire for escapism and justice, which detective fiction provided. So you had your heroes and you had your villains. And so authors like Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and G.K. Chesterton became household names, and their works captivated readers around the world.
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and they all wrote novels. And I mean, we're familiar with a lot of the Agatha Christie novels, like
right.
Murder on the Orient Express and things like that. But they also wrote a lot of short stories and things that were published in magazines and other serials. So people were very familiar with these authors and who they were and the types of stories they were writing. And the excitement they were bringing. And you have to think about it too. It's the 30s. So we just came out of the jazz era and post World War I, the jazz era. There's the fall of Wall Street, which was, I mean, there was a depression around the world. It was worse, I think, in America maybe than in Europe, but Europe still had a lot of issues because they were still recovering financially from World War I. And so you have these writers creating these murder mystery situations where people could escape from that for just a little bit. And it was going to have a good outcome. And most people, I think, like to have a puzzle to solve. It was a way to jump in and solve a puzzle.
Right. Because that way you were there, like right there with the author, and the detective.
And trying to figure out the whodunit type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. What I love about this idea is the Detection Club aimed to promote and celebrate, of course, detective fiction. And it was like they came together and supported each other, very much like today what we would have like a mastermind or retreat.
Oh, yeah.
And they were there to support each other, and there was no competition. And as Jenny mentioned, they even collaborated, which I think I'm definitely going to have to find these stories, but they collaborated together. And as she mentioned, the 3 that they published as a group together, which would be phenomenal to read.
Oh, yeah. And I think when I saw the covers of a couple of them, and these are reprints, but I think it was like author Agatha Christie's name appears at the top, but then, and it said, and the Detection Club or whatever it was on there. So, it's not just her writing it. It was like all of these authors. And the other thing that happened a few years after they got started is they made a deal with the BBC, and they made a couple of radio dramas out of some of their writings with the BBC. So they actually had some stuff that went out over the air as well. And again, it was their writings, what they had formed within the club, and it was presented that way over the airwaves of the BBC, which I thought was pretty cool.
And they still, whereas PBS, but they still promote and share.
Oh yeah, here in America,
their stories. Yeah,
for sure. So, and again, a big part of this was to create a social club so that they could socialize. And they were kind of goofy and tongue in cheek, and being writers, they were very clever when it came to things they were doing. But they decided, as detective writers. Well, actually, we'll mention some of the other folks in it if you want to mention who some of those are.
So, of course, we mentioned G.K. Chesterton, who was the first president, Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Ronald Knox, Freeman Wills Crofts, Arthur Morrison, John Rode, Jesse Rickard, Baroness Emma Orski, R. Austin Freeman, J.D.H. Cole, Margaret Cole, E.C. Bentley, Henry Wade, and H.C. Bailey. And of course, they held their regular meeting. I could just see them coming in their cars or walking because, it's in London. So people probably walked a lot of places more than we do today. And, in their coats and their furs and just dress nicely because people just dressed a lot nicer back then. And, going up to their room, to their meeting room and just, oh my gosh, just if you can just imagine the creativity and the ideas and then them swapping tales back and forth. And I just can't imagine how amazing that must have been to be a little fly on the wall back
Oh,
then.
I would love it. I've never really, I mean, I've done a lot of writing on stuff, but I've never tried to
Right.
write like a murder mystery or anything. So to sit there and to listen to these renowned
Yes.
writers all meet together and throw ideas back and forth like that and joke with each other, I think would be absolutely fabulous. So they did create rules.
So when you were invited into the detection club, this is sort of,
And
this is
remember, you
cute.
had to be invited. They didn't just let
Right.
anybody join.
So you had to walk along a candlelit passage, place their hand upon Eric the skull, which was a skull, a human skull.
There is a picture online of either, and I don't remember who it was, and I'll see if I can find it to post on social media. It's either Agatha Christie or Dorothy Sayers with her hand on the skull.
And of course, they actually had to rename her Erica later because forensic research proved that it was actually a skull of a woman, but nonetheless. And you had to agree to the rules, of course, read by a member wearing a velvet cloak. It almost sounds like a Freemasonry thing
And
meeting.
apparently it was a scarlet velvet cloak I read at
Oh,
one point. So it was very like upscale.
yes.
Yes. So these
With,
are the rules for writing their stories
oh,
as
okay. Thank you.
members. So if you became a member, if they let you into the club, you had to follow these, well, you were supposed to follow these rules when you wrote your mysteries or when you were collaborating and writing stories also with the whole group. So the
Okay, so
first rule is
the criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. So he could be mentioned and then surprise, he does something else.
like the butler type thing.
Yes, exactly. All
All supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course.
not more than one secret room or passage is allowable.
No hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, nor any appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end.
Oh my goodness, I don't even want to read this. No Chinaman must figure in the story. Interesting. Oriental characters were stereotyped in this time period to have mystical knowledge and assassination skills. So it would be similar to letting the crime be solved by magic.
And when we say Oriental, that's in quotations because that's how they referred to it
Right.
in their language at the time. No accident must ever help the detective, nor must he ever have an unaccountable intuition which proves to be right. I feel like they were kind of making fun of all of the Sherlock Holmes stories
Oh, that could
in
be.
a lot of their rule setting
Mhm.
here because those stories predated all of this.
Yep. The detective himself or herself must not himself or herself commit the crime.
The detective must not light on any clues which are not instantly produced for the inspection of the reader.
The stupid friend of the detective, the Watson, which that goes back to prove what you just said about Sherlock Holmes, must not conceal any thoughts which pass through his mind. His intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly, below that of the average reader.
Which kind of cracks me up because I think they're saying their readers aren't very intelligent people.
Right, exactly. He must be an idiot. So just like our readers. Yeah, okay.
And the last rule, twin brothers or sisters and doubles generally must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. So no surprise twins.
So there must be something that they experienced or read or whatever that this was a thing of bone of contention for them. They're like, we're not going to have this in our club.
Well, and I think they wanted to create stories that really were based in like logic, like exciting, right? You
Oh,
want to
yes.
build up the excitement and it leads to something, but like logically, this could potentially be a real thing, even though these are all fictional stories and fictional characters. It could happen in the real world and it could make sense. So they're throwing out any of the weird things that you sometimes see thrown into. And this is why thrillers were not allowed, because thrillers often use paranormal as part of their
Mm-hmm.
stories, or the surprise twin, or they might have be in a mansion that has multiple secret um panels and staircases and all the things. So this was a way to say, we want you to, if you're going to write stories about a situation, whether it's a murder or a thieving thing or whatever, doesn't matter what the crime is, it has to be a logical crime and there has to be a logical conclusion by the time you get to the end, and there can't be all this other woo-woo stuff happening behind the scenes.
Because that's almost like easy out. So that is actually a
Right.
pretty cool idea. So, and then you would have to take an oath. And the oath was, do you promise that your detectives shall well and truly detect the crimes presented to them, using those wits which it may please you to bestow upon them, and not placing reliance on, nor making use of divine revelation, feminine intuition, mumbo jumbo, jiggery pokery, coincidence, or an act of God? Curse would befall you if, oh, wait a minute. Curse would befall if you didn't keep the oath. May other writers anticipate your plots. May total strangers sue you for libel. May your pages swarm with misprint and your sales continually diminish.
Yeah. So if you made the oath, if you
Oh,
swore
gosh.
to no mumbo jumbo, jiggery pokey, coincidence, acts of God, and then you went against any of that, that was your curse. It was very funny. And actually, there are some Agatha Christie stories that have actually kind of fallen to be very ridiculed by this, because she does have a little bit more of a paranormal element to them. But I did read something in one of the articles that I looked at that said she may have done that just to be cheeky, as they put
Mm-hmm.
it, because of who she was. So I just
Exactly.
thought that
I'm
was kind of
Agatha
interesting.
Christie. Yeah,
Right.
let's see if you might. Yeah, if I
And
had missed
I
on my
highly
pages.
doubt they would have kicked one of their original founding members. I mean, unless she had done something horrible, I don't think Agatha Christie was in any danger of being kicked out of the detection club.
Yes. So of course they held regular meetings like we discussed, and they would invite guest speakers.
Mm-hmm.
They would have discussions and debates, of course, everything that related to detective fiction. And then this sounds incredible. The club was famous for its games and challenges such as mock trials, puzzle solving, and detective themed quizzes. I can't even think how much fun these meetings must have been.
Oh, yeah. And part of it was to, again, like these mock trials and things, was to help activate the story writing ideas, right? You're holding a trial
Mhm.
because you're dealing with criminals in your story. So you're trying out these criminal trials to see how it would really work out and what's the best way for your characters to handle this trial and what should the outcome
Mhm.
be and who's guilty and who's not, and how many more people can you involve in the crime. And I just love that they did, like, they kind of acted out the things that they were going to write
Right.
or they were thinking of writing, and then could tell each other, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, or nope, that's not going to work, you can't do it that way.
Well,
So
just the creativity with those minds must have just been phenomenal.
now, there was, from what I gathered, especially as a little bit later years, a lot of drinking, a lot of fun things going on, so they could get a little wild and woolly. And um, Dorothy Sayers, who was very active from the beginning, when she took over the presidency, she really did a lot to keep it going. Because I guess through the war years when World War
Yeah.
II came on, they could have lost a lot of this, but she worked really hard to kind of keep up the morale, keep things positive. She made sure the rent was paid for the club. She made sure that all their servers got well tipped. for dealing with them, and for also dealing with their initiation process and everything, because they had to set things up and bring in all these
Right.
candles and their skull and all the stuff that they would do. And so she made sure the servers and stuff were well taken care of for their involvement in all of this craziness every time they met.
Well, and she was president from 1949 to 1957, so that's 8 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
She was president up until she died at that point. So the first president, as we mentioned, was GK, right?
Mm-hmm.
GK is his first initials. GK Chesterton. And I forgot to include how long he was president for. And then there was somebody else after him. And then Dorothy Sayers, I believe, is the third president of the club. And yes, she held that presidency up until her death in 1957, at which time Agatha Christie took it over as president.
Well, if you go back, let's go back to right after World War II when Dorothy Sayers, we, here in the United States, we had so much of our own, not necessarily rebuilding like London did, but, the men coming home, the women going back to their traditional roles or as wives and mothers, or those who decided, hey, I had my little taste of freedom, that's going to change. But to do this in London and as a woman, to keep this going, I think really says a lot about her.
Yes. And her passion for writing as an author, her passion as an author, and in helping to inspire the passion in these fellow authors. Again, at a time when their world had literally come crashing down.
Yes.
Around their ears, and they could have all said, I'm not going to do this anymore, we're going to give up, we're going to find other avenues to pursue. And she really did that post World War II era going into the 50s. She really helped to keep this club up and going and keep the morale and bringing in new members and inviting people and being goofy. She kept the lightheartedness and the silliness of it all, but she was also very serious about, this is our place with our people to be, where they could grieve for what they'd lost during the war, where they could create what should come after the war and help not only themselves, but all of their readers, all of the people, especially in the UK, but across the world. I mean, these authors, different ones, wrote about different, if you read their novels, they're writing, their stories take place in countries all over the world, and countries that were hard hit by both world wars. And the themes that go with them. And so being able to sort of bring some of that, what took place during the war, because sometimes that's important to the characters they wrote about.
Right.
They bring that to the front in their books. And I think it really, for a lot of people, kind of helped with that healing process, especially after the Second War.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's change the subject to something a little bit lighter. Let's talk about Christmas. So, as Jenny mentioned, detective stories, which, we were talking about in the Victorian era, it was ghost stories. Now we're in the 30s and it's like detective stories, which is actually really cool. So, of course, many of the members of the detection club wrote Christmas themed stories, often blending the mystery and suspense with the festive atmosphere of Christmas. One of the most famous ones is Agatha Christie's The Adventures of the Christmas Pudding, which sounds interesting. It's a 1923 short story which features Hercule Poirot. So if anybody's familiar with the Poirot mystery, is it the Poirot mystery, like on PBS?
Yep.
And of course, he's investigating a theft during the holiday season.
Yeah, he's her most famous detective. She has several detectives she used over her career. He's probably her most well-known, followed by Miss Marple. In fact, there were times she kind of got sick of writing about Poirot because she had to write about him so much, but people loved him. And he was sort of this haughty, stuffy, not quite Sherlock Holmes. He was a little different because he's French. Sherlock Holmes was British. Poirot is French. And so there's a difference in it, but like, he, very intelligent. He's going to solve the mystery. Whereas she did create Miss Marple. And if you're familiar with Miss Marple, who I happen to really like, Miss Marple was an older lady. She wasn't like Poirot was an actual detective. Miss Marple was like amateur detective. and she would solve these mysteries in kind of a busybody and sort of a way to get to the mysteries. And, the cute, innocent looking old lady who could just solve the mysteries. Maybe not quite. So what's her name from Murder, She Wrote? Not Angela Lansbury, but her character, Jessica. Oh my gosh. I've watched so many episodes of Murder, She Wrote, and now the name is slipping my mind.
Oh my goodness. Well, or it could be like the new one that is Matlock with Catherine
with
Bates.
Kathy Bates. Yes. I haven't watched it yet. I keep meaning to watch it.
It's good, but like she said, she's an old lady and nobody suspects her.
And that was kind of Miss Marple. There's a lot of times where nobody suspects her. So yeah, Poirot, very famous detective. He's right up there with Sherlock Holmes and the other detectives.
And then we have Dorothy Sayers, who wrote The Nine Tailors. While it's not exclusively a Christmas story, this 1934 novel features a festive setting and explores themes of redemption and forgiveness. And then we have G.K. Chesterton's, who was the first president, as we mentioned. The White Christmas is a 1908 short story, which was part of Chesterton's Father Brown series. And it takes place on a snowy Christmas Eve and features the priest detective solving a mystery.
As usual. I always like the fact that he's a priest, but he's also a detective.
Right.
I always thought that was kind of cool about him.
And then other Christmas tales by the Detection Club is Nigel Marsh's The Surfeit of Lampreys, 1941, and Edmund Crispin's The Case of the Gilded Fly, written in 1944, which features a Christmas party setting. So we can just only figure what that may be about.
Yeah. And there's a whole lot more. These are just some of the ones I picked out that now I've heard of A Surfeit of Lampreys in a movie. I don't know what movie it is. I recognize the title of the book. I've never read the story. And it's been bugging me since I read about that. What movie it's an older movie and they mentioned the book in the movie. So obviously it was well known and it's an American movie. So it was read over here if they mentioned it in the movie. But I cannot for the life of me figure out what movie I've heard that in. And so, but yes.
I have to do a Google search and find out.
Yeah, I probably should have. And I was like, whatever. But maybe one of our listeners wants to tell me too, because I know I've heard it and I just don't know where I've heard it. But yes, so all of these detective stories that, again, in the UK especially, but even around the world, it's starting to grow. I know I picked up a book last year and I can't remember the name of it, but it was a murder mystery that took place at Christmas. It like starts on Christmas Eve and goes over the next couple of days. And what's nice about these stories is, yes, they're a mystery. And yes, you're going along for the story and you're trying to follow, you think you know who did it. And sometimes you figure it out and sometimes you're surprised because they put that little twist in at the end.
Right.
But a lot of times it makes for easy reading in the fact that you're not having to like overanalyze it necessarily or anything. Yeah. It's just an enjoyable read. And I don't want to say thrilling because that's the wrong word since they're not thrillers and they're specifically not thrillers, but it's exciting enough that it keeps you interested and keeps you going until the end. And a lot of them aren't super long, like even the novels that they wrote, with the exception of some of Agatha Christie's, because some of her novels are like, I've read Murder on the Orient Express and that one's a little longer. And some of her other ones, but some of these are not all that long. So it's like, especially over like Christmas vacation, if you've got time off and you want to just sit and read something, it's something you can easily sit and read.
Or even just read aloud because, in the 30s, it's not like they had TV. They had radio, of course. But then, because I'm reading a book now, or it's a diary, Civil War diary, but granted, I know it's the difference between Civil War and the 1930s. But the daughter was always reading to the father.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember reading to my kids when they were little. And I bet you that's what a lot of what they did was also sit around. Imagine sitting around with your family and reading this story. Oh. And then as the story goes on, you're like trying to solve the mystery together. I think that would be so much fun.
Oh, yeah. And to sit and listen to it, I could see like maybe dad reading it every night, read a chapter a night or whatever until you've solved the mystery. I just think it's really cool that these particular stories, again, we think of ghost stories. We think of actual Christmas stories. We just we we have an upcoming episode where we were talking about Pamela McCall's "'Twas the Night Before" book that she wrote last year,
Right.
that focused on Clement Seymour's poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," and those are things that we immediately think of. The Polar Express. When we go to children's stories, the Polar Express became super popular in the early 2000s, I think, is when that one was
I
published.
think so.
I feel like, I mean, my kids were, I remember little, and we had, well, at one point we had 3 copies of that book because I think each kid was at some point by other relatives and stuff given a copy of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're down to 1. I think I did give away a couple of copies because I just didn't want to keep that many of them. But those are books we think of. And when we think of other stories, especially once TV came into being, we think of like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Charlie Brown's Christmas and all the stop motion like Santa Claus movies that they made.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, all of those are things that we instantly think about when we think of Christmas things and Christmas stories. And then, of course, there's the Bible if you want to go religiously, and there's the Christmas story there. And you don't think mysteries, murder, and a lot of these happen to be murder mysteries. Not all of them, like the Perot story, The Adventures of the Christmas Pudding. It's not actually a murder mystery. It's a theft in this case. And Perot's going to find out who did it. But they're all the whodunit type of things and those stories that did become popular. And that, I think, really interestingly enough, because they had their guidelines and they had their rules. And yes, their rules are a little funny and whatever, but it really did help them to develop a genre that didn't necessarily exist the way it does now, I think. And I think with the members that are in the modern day club now, who are still there, they meet 3 times a year, I read, and still get together and do some of these things, and they play the games and they have the meetings and they become the minds coming together or whatever. I think it still helps give them a guide for what they want to produce as writers. Right. But I also think it's inspired other writers who maybe genres aren't quite so particular, like in the mystery thing. And I'm thinking specifically being a Nancy Drew fan. I mean, I've read like all the older Nancy Drew books and I've been collecting them for years. And I can see some of those same rules kind of being followed in those books. Not necessarily to a T, because I can think of several of them that break some of those rules too. Right. But that gets then younger generations interested in reading that kind of story.
And just the thought of it, just like this mastermind. I mean, we talk about masterminds now and how it's such I don't say a trending word where you think about it. 100 years ago, even before 100 years ago, the greatest, probably some of the greatest writing minds of the world hung out with their candles and their skull and probably came up with some of the amazing detective stories ever written.
I just love the theatrics of it all. They were like, yes, we're going to sit and write stories, but let's be theatrical about our meetings together. And let's to be, if you weren't fortunate enough to have the creativity to be that kind of writer, but if you were lucky enough to be one of the servers that was serving their food and all their drinks and stuff, and to overhear, I mean, you would overhear some of what they were talking about. They
wouldn't, you were like, not even, it's just the waiter that, we're not going to worry, you would be like literally fly on the wall. And it must have been.
Well, and one of the things I read about Dorothy Sayers in one of the articles I was reading, so some of the members imbibed in quite a bit during these meetings. And so they wouldn't necessarily have very good memories the next day. But she was very good at reassuring them that, no, they behaved very well, even I think if they didn't. And again, she made sure that messes got cleaned up and that the servers were well taken care of. And I'm almost wondering if any of the like more minor characters in their stories were ever based on any of those servers and stuff.
Oh, that would be.
I have no idea. Nothing I read said that, but it just made me thought, like, did they inspire a character coming and going like they did? And, and if you go out to a restaurant now, when you have a really good server, they're chatty with you and they might joke with you and they, take good care of you. That might inspire me to include one of them.
It leaves an impression. Then, yeah.
I think that
I
would be
would
so
be
cool.
surprised if they didn't.
Yeah. I just think it was so cool. And, they, like I said, they formed this social club that still exists for this particular genre
Right.
of writers. And they
That's the
were,
cool thing.
yeah, and I think I'm trying to remember if I read if it was 2020 or 2022. I should have put it in the notes. One of those 2 years, it was either 2020 or 2022. They did put together, or maybe it was both years, because there's two collections of books now,
Okay.
or two books with collections of stories from these particular writers that got put together. Maybe it was 2020 and 2022, but specifically with the Christmas stories in them. And they're available online, I know, or probably in a lot of actual bookshops and bookstores where you can read them. And it's just a collection of them. But Martin Edwards, the current president, had a big hand in getting those particular stories all put together and grouped together like this so that you can go back and read them, because these older detective stories are making a very big comeback, and a resurgence. And of course, some of them, as we know, the Father Brown series became a television
Right.
series and a mini series, and Agatha Christie's stories have been turned into plays and movies
Right.
and everything. I mean, that's why we know her so well. Plus, she
Mhm.
had her whole mysterious um,
Yeah.
disappearance for a while there. And I really want to, and this will be a future episode, I want to do an episode on Dorothy Sayers. I know she's a little more famous, but she herself is just a really cool lady. And
We
as I
will.
was reading about what she did specifically for this club,
Mhm.
there was a lot of stuff that she did that didn't involve the club, that she's a fascinating woman. So we will take a deeper dive into Dorothy Sayers in a future episode, because I think she was really cool. There were actually two other women who were original members, which was really cool because there were a lot of other writers clubs at the time. Um, like C.S. Lewis had his own club. He's the author.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine that? And I'm sure J.R.R. Tolkien
Yeah.
came visit it quite often because
And
they
they
would love
belonged to
his
clubs,
friend.
but his club only admitted one woman in all that time. And when they started this one, they admitted four right from the beginning. So I think they decided ladies could be detective
Hmm.
authors
Well,
just as
probably
much
because the
as
other
the
one,
men.
yep, probably because the other ones didn't. So they said we're going to have women in our detection.
Well, and I think, and I don't, again, I'm not familiar with every single one of these authors that was here. But it sounded like, from what I was learning, a lot of them had been writing for quite some time. They started writing in the late teens and 20s, and grew in popularity. And so again, their stories were already fairly well known and stuff by the time they formed this little party club. But they included whoever they felt was worthy of being included, because they were good detective writers and they weren't writing just weird, crazy stories that
Right.
didn't make sense. Did you ever? This came out, I believe, in the late 70s. The movie Murder by Death.
I don't think so.
So I remember watching this. I watched it, actually, I own it now, but I watched it recently. It'd been years and years. I remembered watching it as a kid, and the version I watched was recorded off the TV, and it was highly edited, because there is a lot of adult humor in it that went way over my head when I watched it at 10. But I was thinking about this movie as I was learning about this club, because the whole premise of this movie, and I'm hoping some of our listeners will have seen it. The whole premise of this movie is this guy invites all these detective writers to his house, and then there's bodies there, like he gets killed supposedly, and then the butler gets killed, and they're all trying, these detective writers are trying to do it, and all these other weird things are happening, and there's things happening in the movie that they specifically list in their rules that they're not
Oh,
supposed
how
to have. But
fun.
it makes me wonder if the detection club maybe inspired that movie or something similar, because
From what you said, it sure sounds, I would be surprised if it didn't.
yeah, and all of the detectives that are invited are based off of characters that we know well in some of these other stories. Like there is a character, and I can't think of her name right now, that is a Miss Marple character. She's not, and all of them, and there's another one who's very much like the Dick Tracy kind of character and all of
Oh,
that.
funny.
So it's a great movie. And I want to say it came out in the late 70s or early 80s. Um, it's such a fun movie. Maggie Smith is in it.
Well,
She's
that okay, there you go. That's
yeah,
my reason to watch it.
yeah. It's a great movie. But it kind of made me think as I was putting this together and reading all the articles and stuff on this, I was like, I wonder if this was kind of an inspiration for making that particular movie. I have no idea. I don't remember who directed it or anything.
It'll be interesting to find out a little bit more about the movie now.
But yeah, it's called Murder by Death, which is a fun play on words in the title, and it's a great movie. And yeah, definitely, it was definitely inspired at least by the writers and some of their characters that they
Right.
formed that generations of readers found beloved, like Perot. Like, yes, one of the characters is based off of Perot. So
Okay, so it almost sounds like it might be a movie about the detection club.
kind of, and
Yeah.
they get together and it's this weekend. I'm actually, even though we're still recording, I'm actually just looking it up real quick because my head is wanting to know certain things. Um, so it has, oh yeah, Peter Sellers is in it. I was thinking of that. I was like, so Peter Falk is in it. Peter Sellers is in it. Elsa Lancaster, uh, Maggie Smith, Alec Guinness. So some big names are in it.
Mhm.
Uh,
British names.
yes, yes, yes. And it came out in 1978. Is that what it says? Or 79? So yeah, late 70s.
Okay.
It's a great movie. It's like I said, I love the movie. Oh, 76. There it is. 1976. Oh, it's as old as my husband.
Like I said, you weren't even born yet.
No, like I said, I remember watching it as a kid, and my parents had, VCRs came out and they recorded it
Yep.
off the TV, but it was the edited for TV version. And so when I was old enough to really watch the whole thing again, I was like, oh. And then, of course, the stuff that did get left in had gone way over my head, as many detective stories would have at that age.
Because I was 12. But then there was like you mentioned Peter Falk. So that
Mm-hmm.
would have been Columbo.
Yep.
Um, who was the other one? Oh, Peter Sellers,
Yes.
of course, the Pink Panther. So, and
Yes.
who
And
was
those
the
were
other
the
one
types
way
of
at the
characters they were
yeah.
portraying in this movie. And,
I might
trying
have to
to
watch it
be,
now.
yeah, it's hilarious. It's great. And I know, I mean, I own it now, but it is available on some of the streaming services if you're
Okay,
interested.
I'll have to look for it.
So, and
I'll
I
have
will
to go
actually,
detecting to find it.
for anybody who's interested in any of the stories that we were mentioning today, I'll put links in the show notes for especially the collections that came out over the last couple of years that were put together specifically for Christmas. I will have them linked in the show notes if you want to purchase them and read them yourself. Um,
I
maybe
don't know.
start.
There's just nothing better than going back and reading these older works by these famous authors because it seems like writing has changed, where it just seems like I don't say streamlined, but it's just different. It's a different genre. It's a different time period. Is the writers were different, and I think it would be really so much fun to go back and read their works.
Oh, yeah. And one of the best things to me about reading, I hate to say this for these historical writings, but they are. I mean, they started in 1930. They're getting close
Yeah,
to 100 years old. Some of their older stories are 100 years old,
yeah,
but it's a really great way to pick up on nuances from those time periods.
right.
The little, the way people dressed, there are certain
Mhm.
phrases that got used all the time when they spoke. Um, what a restaurant was like in the 30s compared to what we see when we go into a restaurant today. Chain restaurants like we're used to
Yeah,
didn't necessarily exist at that time. It was so there's those little things they talk about the cars and how those are different. So I think one of the greatest things about reading any kind of historical story, whether it's a detective story or any other kind of novel, is we pick up a lot on what the world was like in that moment when those stories were written. And I feel like, and this is why I totally am cool with reading fiction, even when you're trying to learn history. You're going to learn a lot of history, even from fictional stories, because authors are writing about what they know at the time. So, think about what people are wearing and,
Exactly.
all of that. And that makes it into those stories. I mean, if we read some of the stories written in modern times from the early 2000s, when cell phones were just becoming a more popular thing, they're all flip phones. For example, actually, a good example would be the Twilight series. There's cell phones involved in the story, but they're definitely flip phones. They're not smartphones. It's not something that everybody had all the time. And when I've reread those in recent years, it kind of makes me giggle because I'm like, oh yeah, they didn't just have it. And I'm pretty sure by the time all the movies came out, we were using smartphones. And so in the movie version, I think they have some of that. But if you read the books, they're still using the little tiny flip phones that we used to use once upon a time. So
it's like an opportunity to travel back in time, and when supposedly life was simpler and all that stuff. So I think that would be I think it'd be fun to do that.
Well, I say this is a great chance if you're in the UK, and we actually have quite a few listeners in the UK. So maybe you're probably familiar with some of these books being in your bookstores, as this article is saying, but maybe here in the US or in New Zealand or some of the other countries, maybe this is a chance to start a new Christmas tradition.
That would be fun. Yeah.
By starting, these mysteries, these Christmas mysteries. So like I said, I'll make sure these are linked in the show notes. There will be pictures of the 3 grave sites that I could locate for the 3 of our 4 founding members that we talked about at the beginning. So G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers, and Agatha Christie, because we know where they're buried. They all have headstones. They're all, I think, well-visited grave sites because of who they were. Yeah. Unfortunately, again, I couldn't find out about Anthony Berkeley Cox, who's, interestingly enough, he started the club and I don't think he was ever president. So and maybe he didn't want the responsibility, because I know even Agatha Christie, it said, even when she was president, she didn't always like doing the public speaking part of it and all of that. So she would share that responsibility with other members and get them to take over and do that part for her.
That is so cool. And you just don't think of them, a person like that, of that status, not even being uncomfortable speaking in front of her peers, her friends.
So right. It's not like it was like just a TED talk in front of a bunch of strangers.
Right, exactly.
These were other people in her industry. They're all publishing novels with their publishers, and probably the same publisher she used in some instances. So, but apparently that wasn't her favorite part of being in the club, and so she delegated.
That is so interesting.
Which I love to find that out about her.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'll have all of this linked. We'll have some other things linked. So if you want to, like I said, maybe start a new tradition this year.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Read a mystery, a detective.
With your family.
Yes. And I think that would be, something new, something different. I know we're always trying to, sometimes you're trying to find something different. Or if you're like traveling this year in your travels, like if you're on a plane and you want to read, or a long road trip or whatever, in between family.
That's true too.
A great solution to keeping your mind occupied.
Oh, that would be fun too, especially if you're stuck on an airplane or an airport.
Stuck in the airport for 3 or 4 hours over a layover.
Take a detective story with you.
Take a Christmas-based detective story or winter-based.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'll put the suggestions in the show notes if you want more suggestions, folks. And we'll see you next week.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this Ordinary Extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Diane and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.